In this video, I'm going to walk us through how we go about coding qualitative data. Now, it's important for me to mention that although in this lecture and in the reading for this week, we provide a kind of general overview of qualitative coding, this is actually a very in-depth process, a very lengthy process that essentially you could almost have a whole course on. Whereas in this class, we're really talking about it for 1 week. So know that this is kind of a sweeping overview of qualitative coding. And if you're interested in doing a qualitative study in the future, I highly recommend that you look into taking other courses on qualitative research in particular, or reading articles about how other researchers go about doing this kind of analysis. Or you can even talk to me about it, because I'd love to share some of my own experiences learning and trying different qualitative coding techniques. Lockmiller and Lester talk about 3 general types of coding procedures that qualitative researchers use. There's a priori codes, or a priori coding. There's descriptive coding and in vivo coding. A priori coding is a type of coding procedure that's often used by folks from the positivist or post-positivist realm. They happen to be doing qualitative research. And the reason why I say that is because this type of coding procedure is actually a deductive approach to coding. So a priori means that you're bringing some kind of theory or some kind of structure to the codes themselves, that you have something ahead of time. That's where a priori comes into play. You have a theory in mind or some concepts you specifically want to look for. You have your theory. You want to see how it's represented or applied to the data. This is essentially a deductive approach to qualitative coding. You do see this one, but it's not the most frequently used. The most frequently used types of coding procedures would be descriptive or in vivo. Descriptive is really essentially the inductive approach to coding, where you're reading all of the data and you're trying to come up with codes, that is, specific categories or themes from the data. That if a bunch of people mentioned, for instance, that their experience entailed going to professional development workshops at conferences, I might have codes such as professional development, or codes such as conferences. Now, those would be descriptive codes if I don't use the actual language from the participants. In vivo codes is when you actually use their own language. And in vivo codes are really especially important for projects on a particular cultural group. So you'll often find ethnographic-based studies or phenomenology studies using in vivo codes. Grounded theory and sometimes case studies and others are likely to use descriptive coding. Narrative designs are often using in vivo coding, because in vivo coding can be really powerful if you're heavily interested in the participant voices. So if you really want to honor the voices, honor the word choice that they had, you would create a theme or identify themes in your data from their actual words. It's a really powerful coding technique by using that. So to give a specific example of the differences here, I have an image of a beer flavor map. Now, whether or not you drink beer, I personally can't, but whether or not you drink beer you can still pull something from this image and understand the relationship between different types of coding and the different levels, essentially, of codes. So each of these little words here, like butter, cream, goat, candy, lilac, all of these different types of flavors, cherry, strawberry, all of these might be codes. And then when you bring or group codes together into something else, the next thing would be what's called a category. So here we have herbaceous, earthy, vegetal, alcoholic, things like that. These might be considered categories where you're grouping the codes together into a similar type of grouping. So here are all the ones that relate to grass or leafiness or things like that. So here is a category of grassy. Then when you get even bigger, when you group some of these categories together, that's when you get into what's called themes. So codes are the smallest, then we move to categories, and the final thing is major themes, where the themes in this might relate to how your mouth feels when you're drinking it, what's the aroma, what's the taste. So these would be examples of descriptive codes, unless they came up with like baked beans as being a flavor of beer. If somebody actually described it that way, then that would make this in vivo coding. And by the time you get to themes with in vivo coding, you might have lost this specific word. So it would be really important if you want to use in vivo coding to maintain something about the actual words people used. Let's apply this to my own study on the faculty who teach multicultural education courses. In this particular study, I might actually recommend to start with descriptive coding. Otherwise, I could use in vivo coding. I suspect that a lot of the things that we'll talk about in our interviews are kind of factually based, but there might be some things that people talk about the nature of their professional development or the nature of their teacher preparation programs or preparing future faculty programs, where if they get into, oh, this professional development I went to was really great for this reason, and they start to really describe it, then in vivo coding might be really helpful for me there to make sure that I get exactly how they described it. But otherwise, descriptive coding, which is the most often used and general approach to qualitative coding, might best fit this particular study. To summarize, qualitative coding and qualitative data analysis in general is very cyclical, it's data-driven, and it's highly reflective. You'll notice that even with talking about the coding procedures in this video, you're going to want to pick your coding approach with a lot of intention. You'll also want to make sure that you log and store your data appropriately to maintain the confidentiality of your research participants. Anything that you choose to do in terms of your data analysis and even how you log and store your data should ultimately reflect the goal and design that you have for your research project. And you'll notice that throughout this video, not only did I go back, this video lecture series rather, not only did I go back to the characteristics for qualitative research, but I even went back to some of our content from the week on research ethics, because research ethics are going to be important throughout the whole research process, and for qualitative research, the characteristics for this methodology should be present throughout the whole process.